Welcome to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. My name is Dave. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's go. We're going to start the episode right now. Happy to have you here. Let's do this. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you here. We're going to talk about implementing a project-based pricing platform or program around your podcast support services. And we want to first, the big thing we have to do when we're planning out our podcast editing services before we go out into the world, or as we revamp what we're doing currently, is we really need to spend some time to assess the scope of the project that we're looking to bid on, that we're seeking a podcaster, or that before we post anything to our website as far as offers, we need to talk about project scope, because I think this is something that we don't spend a lot of time on, and it comes up in small little things, will creep into what you're doing for a host that just continue to add more layers to what you do, and you realize that you're doing more work for less amount of money. So knowing the project scope is something that we should all focus on as early podcast editors and support people. And again, for you hosts that listen to the show, this is also something for you to keep in mind when you're talking to an editor. So how do we implement project-based pricing for podcast support services? What do? Well, you're in the right spot. Here we go. When I'm looking at assessing the scope of a project, a new project, an existing project, whatever, one of the things that I love to do is to conduct a thorough client interview prior to agreeing to anything to do with project scope. When I sit down with a podcaster, I want to know a lot about the show and a lot about the host. I want to look at discussing the podcast and what type of show is this show? Because that's also going to be something that feeds into what we do behind the scenes. Is this a solo hosted podcast? Just one person, one track? That's it? Is it interview based? Is it a panel discussion with many voices? What kind of podcast format is this show? I also want to know about the target audience. Like, who are we talking to here? Is this a medical podcast? And there's going to be a lot of medical terms, and the show notes have to be perfect, and you can't have any misspellings, or because you're talking about drugs and medicine and procedures and medical terms that you're going to have to go research if you're not a doctor yourself. So I need to know that kind of stuff as well. How frequently are we releasing episodes? And then if there's any specific needs that this podcaster is looking for that we can help with. So understanding a thorough client interview, and I would suggest that there's many things you need to keep in touch with that, keep in mind with that as you plan out this interview. So if you're interested, I do have a document that I use. And if you're interested, reach out to me and I'll send you a PDF of it. And you can tweak it and play with it as much as you want. But it's kind of like my main high-level client interview process that I use when I talk to a new podcaster. So when you assess the project scope, make sure you take time to have a thorough interview and discussion with your client before you make any decisions or talk about any pricing at all. Talk to the client. The second one, just review all and any existing content from this creator. When I sit down to talk to somebody before we even meet, I'm going to go check out their social media. I'm going to check out their website. If they have a podcast currently, I want to listen to it. I want to get a sense of what they put out into the world. And for the most part, I would anticipate what they've put into the world is their definition of good or good enough. So it gives me kind of a scale to kind of know where I sit, what I can bring to the conversation, what I can bring to the podcaster. And it gives me a chance to kind of evaluate my skill set with what they're doing currently. So if they're a video podcast and they do like 3 video clips a day, 7 days a week for one episode, each episode gets a lot of promotion. They are everywhere on every platform. That's a big team. That's not one person. So that's going to give me some perspective when I sit down with them. But review all of the content this person is putting into the world. And I would say, again, if they have a show, listen to several episodes. The other thing, if they don't have a show, then go to YouTube and search that person up as a guest on other people's podcasts, because then you're going to hear them on the mic and see if they even have a mic. So that's one way to kind of check out. But do check out the client ahead of sitting down with them. I think you're going to be able to bring more to the conversation just by doing your homework. And then the next part of all this around project scope is I would encourage you to identify all of the required tasks involved to support this content creator. When I sit down with a new client, I list out everything from audio editing to show notes to episode titles, transcriptions, social media assets. And then also I want to know like video, audio, YouTube, like there's so many different pieces that if you go in blind, your expectation as a podcast editor might be one thing. And it happened to me. I had a creator come on and they basically wanted to pay me nothing and have me do everything. So that didn't last very long at all. It's like, no, you're asking for $1,000 worth of effort for $5. So no, I'm not going to sign up for that. You need to identify all the required tasks and the anticipated tasks that maybe you do for other people or you see other people doing for people. So you need to have this kind of robust list of what you do and what you offer. That should mirror what's on your website. If you have a website for your business, your podcast editing and support business, which you should have a website, that's how people are going to find you first. Identify all the required tasks that this person may or may not have considered, and at least you are driving the ship and driving the conversation there. The last part of all this around assessing the scope of a project is to consider any potential challenges that might come up, maybe things that you haven't really thought of or they haven't thought of, but you need to anticipate this, any challenges possible. This is the part in the conversation where I try to factor in things like more complex editing. So when we talk about having multiple voices or having some music or sounds or things in the background that complement it, is this a true crime podcast, a 2-hour episode with lots of moving pieces and lots of elements beyond the spoken word of the host? You need to make sure that you have something in place for all this complex editing requirements, or if there's many guests and you're having to deal with different audio tracks and different levels, there's a lot of moving things here. So you really want to make sure that you consider any potential challenges that might arise outside of the initial conversation you have with the content creator. So an example, for a weekly interview style podcast, the scope, the project scope might include 4 hours of audio editing, 2 hours of show notes, and 3 hours of social media content per episode. So 9 hours for one episode. Do you as an editor have 9 hours for this one client with all of the other things you have going on and all the other clients and your own show and life and work? Do you have 9 hours to commit to this person on a weekly basis? Podcast hosts, are you willing to pay for 9 hours worth of support? Or are you just looking for the 4 hours of audio editing and you're going to do all the other stuff? That's the stuff we need to talk about when we sit down as editors with hosts, so that we get a good concept of what is the scope of your project. What are you anticipating as a host that I'm going to do for you as an editor and a support person? And as a support and editor, what are your expectations of what it's going to take financially and time-wise to support this podcaster? When the two of you have a concept and an appreciation for what each one does and what it's going to cost in time and money, I think you're going to have a more robust conversation around creating a working relationship between a host and an editor, as well as a support person. If you have questions about any of this and you need help from a podcast host perspective, which I am, or as a podcast editor and support person, which I also am, I would love to help you at podcasteditingandsupport.com. Thanks for listening to the show. More episodes coming up. Lots of good stuff as we move into the end of 2024 and looking forward to you securing your next podcast to work on, and for you as a host to find an amazing editor who truly loves and respects what you do and gives you the great tools and support for you to grow your show. It's all here on Podcast Editing and Support Show. Thanks for listening to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Visit us at podcasteditingandsupport.com, podcasteditingandsupport.com. We would love to help you find a great podcast editor, or if you want to hire us, we would love to work with you. Podcasteditingandsupport.com. Catch you on the next episode. Take care.